Hello everyone, it's Macready Musings here, and welcome to part 17 of the history of Magic the Gathering, told through a card from every set. Today we'll be looking at Kaldheim, a Viking-inspired plain of ice and snow from Innistrad sun where the Frostpyres flow. Then we have Strixhaven, School of Mages, an instant and sorcery-focused set based at a magical university. We'll remember to stop by in Faerun for an adventure in the Forgotten Realms, a standard legal D&D crossover set. And finally, we'll be making our third trip to Innistrad for both the werewolf-themed Midnight Hunt and the vampire-themed Crimson Vow. We're getting scarily close to the present, but let's not let that dissuade us from jumping right in. Kaldheim was unleashed from Starnheim in February of 2021. A Norse mythology-inspired set, Kaldheim literally means cold home in Norwegian, which is appropriate because it's a pretty cool set. Unlike that joke though, Kaldheim is also pretty complex. At the time of its release, it had the highest number of average words of rules text per card, with an average of 32.9 words on every card in the set. This is according to some data run by Redditor Pfirpfel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you want proof that Kaldheim was complex, here's a test. Without googling it, tell me what the card Cosmina, God of the Voyage does. Bonus points if you can also tell me what the Omen Keel, the vehicle on her reverse side, does. Yes, Kaldheim's gods are unique compared to the other gods of the multiverse for two reasons. Number one, they're all double-sided. Some of them have artifacts on their reverse side, and some of them have enchantments, and some of them just have other creatures. And number two, they don't have any kind of indestructibility, or an ability to pop themselves back into your library third from the top, or anything like that. You hit them with a removal spell, and they're gone. Which is appropriate because, spoiler warning for Norse mythology, the gods can and do die in that as well. So this is a definite flavour win. Speaking of flavour wins, I really like the design on Toralf's hammer. That's Kaldheim's equivalent of Mjolnir, the Hammer of Thor. So it's a hammer that shoots lightning. You equip it onto a creature and then unequip it to deal 3 damage. You know, the same amount of damage that the spell Lightning Bolt does? I think that's neat. Also, only legendary creatures can get the +3/+0 bonus which the hammer provides, which I think is more of a nod to Marvel's Mjolnir and the whole "whosoever holds this hammer if they be worthy shall possess the power of Thor" than it is a reference to Norse mythology, but I still think this is neat. Anyway, my chosen card to represent Kaldheim isn't a god. Well, there's a god in its art and there's a god in its name, but it's a sorcery. Let's talk about Alrond's Epiphany. Not quite as problematic as Omnath, but still a banned card. So for 7 mana, 2 of which must be blue, Alrond's Epiphany gives you 2 1/1 bird tokens with flying and an extra turn, then it exiles itself. You can also foretell it, that lets you exile a card face down for 2 mana and then cast it on a later turn for a discounted cost. The main reason Alrond's Epiphany is banned is its extra turn effect. Extra turn cards have a long history of being problematic. A few years before Alrond's Epiphany, Nexus of Fate was banned. First in Best of 1 standard on MTG Arena, and then in Pioneer. Time Walk is in the Power 9, and although it's not banned, I'm sure I don't need to tell you about Expropriate. So, what makes extra turn cards so powerful? In the late game, once a control deck has countered or destroyed all of their opponent's potential threats, they want to bring out their own win condition to close the game out. Extra turn spells can be used both to give control decks more time to get their win condition cards into play, or to beat their opponents down if their win cons are already in play, whilst denying the opposition a chance to draw into an answer. The 2 birds Alrond's Epiphany grants are also a nice bonus, as they provide just a little extra shove of inevitability. Alrond's Epiphany also happened to be in standard alongside a plethora of cheap copying effects like Galvanic Iteration from Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Teach by Example from Strixhaven School of Mages. If you can copy an extra turn spell with an effect like this, you get 2 for the price of 1, and if on either of those extra turns you're able to cast another extra turn spell, well that's just the game pretty much closed out. Alrond's Epiphany wasn't the only Kaldheim card to be banned from standard. Faceless Haven was also banned, both because of how easily it slotted into aggro decks of any colour, given that you could very easily swap out all of your basic lands for snow lands, and also because of an incredibly unfun combo involving it and the card Book of Exalted Deeds, which prevented you from losing the game unless an opponent is packing some land destruction. But I already made a separate video discussing that. With Alrond's Epiphany gone, standard was saved from the menace of extra turn spells. Although, Alchemist's Gambit is still hanging around. It doesn't give you any ravens, and you need to be playing an Izzet, but it's out there, so if you're really determined to take some extra turns, there are still options open to you. Admissions opened for Strixhaven, School of Mages, in April of 2021. I think the design of Strixhaven is really cool. It's a faction-based set that uses enemy colours in an interesting way. Each of the 5 colleges is based around an enemy colour pair, and they use the differences in the colours' philosophies to interesting effect. Lorehold, the College of History, is based in red and white. It's designed to show the conflict as to whether history is an ordered process, which is dictated by predictable observable patterns, or whether it's chaotic and random, and we can't determine its course. Silverquill, the white-black literature college, shows how literature and words can be used both to inspire and to motivate, but also to confront and to speak truth to power. Witherbloom is the biology and natural sciences college. It focuses on the fragile balance between life and death, growth and rot, symbiosis and parasitism in nature. Quandrix is the maths college. Its blue aspect reflects the theoretical and abstract nature of mathematics, whilst its green aspect focuses on maths as a concrete, realised thing. Finally, Prismari is the drama and arts college. It reflects how art can be both something you throw yourself into passionately, improvisationally and chaotically, on an emotional level, but also something you meticulously and precisely practice on an intellectual level. In terms of actual mechanical design, some of the colleges tried some pretty novel stuff in Limited. Lawhold was a red-white control deck, which is conceptually really cool. That's a really novel archetype, and even though lots of pros felt it didn't quite work and they were one of the weaker Limited archetypes, I still like this innovation. And if you get a Hoffrey Ghostforge, pack one, pick one, you can build a great deck. Silverquill was a white-black aggro deck, incorporating +1/+1 counters. Not quite as novel, but still a fun archetype to play around with. Witherbloom was green/black life gain and sacrifice. This is a strategy that black has done set after set, but you don't often see green sacrifice strategies pushed like this. Prismari was a red and blue big spells matter deck, which used treasure tokens to ramp up to its biggest cards. It was neat that the treasure tokens here were used to represent works of art rather than literal treasures, and even though red/blue Spellslinger is a very, very tried and tested archetype, it still felt fun to play here. Finally, Quandrix has a ramp and +1/+1 counter theme. It's probably the college which is the most mechanically similar to its Ravnican Guild counterpart, and I sort of wish they'd done something a bit more bold here, but equally, given that Simic has had some problematic recent cards, I can understand why they didn't want to push the boat out too much. Alright, so I think I've established at this stage that I'm pretty fond of Strixhaven. It's got a really fun Limited environment, and I haven't even mentioned the lesson/learn mechanic, which I won't go into here, but which adds a really neat layer of complexity to the draft experience. This set also comes with a set of Mystical Archive cards that are iconic instants and sorceries from the game's history, which are given a new art treatment and slotted into each Strixhaven pack. They're legal in Limited, but not in Standard. They also have really, really fantastic alternative artwork if you can get your hands on a Japanese Strixhaven pack. Now, for my card to represent the set, I thought about going with one of the Elder Dragons. They're all pretty interesting commanders, although some Velamarcus Lawhold decks are designed to give you infinite combat phases, which isn't always super fun to play against. But ultimately, I think I'm going to go with one of the students. Strixhaven had a cycle of uncommon legendary students, one from each college. These students feature on the booster packs for Strixhaven, and they're scattered through the art of lots of cards in the set. I've heard that the internet likes top 5 lists, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through these students' EDH Rec ranking as commanders, and the number 1 card will be my card to represent the set. Let's go! At number 5, we have Rufa, Mercurial Artist, who currently leads 299 decks. For red, a blue, and a mana of any colour, Rufa is a 1/4 Orc Shaman. For 2 mana, you can return her to your hand to copy an instant or sorcery spell you control. I actually think Rufa is a lot more fun as a commander than the 299 decks she has on EDH Rec would indicate. I think possibly this reflects how spell copying isn't really a novel effect, and lots of cards can do it, but pop an errant street artist in your Rufa deck to copy the copies you make and you'll be going to the races. Also, whilst it needs to be in your 99 and can't be in the command zone, Candlekeep Sage will let you draw a card every time you bounce Rufa in and out of play, which works nicely. At number 4, we have Zimone, Quandrix Prodigy, at 354 decks. For a blue and a green, Zimone is a 1/2 human wizard with 2 activated abilities. You can pay 1 mana and tap Zimone to put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or pay 4 mana to draw a card, or draw 2 cards if you have 8 or more lands in play. Like with Rufa, I think what keeps Zimone from being a more popular commander is the fact that this isn't really a novel effect. If you're going to build a Simic ramp deck, Tatyova and AC Tyre of Vijaya Straits tend to be the go-to choices, as despite their higher mana value, they can offer you card draw at a much cheaper rate. At number 3, we have Quintorius Field Historian, who has 772 decks to his name. At 5 mana, Quintorius is the costliest card in the cycle. He's a 2/4 Elephant Cleric who gives all of your spirits +1/+0 and creates a free 2 spirit token whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard. Quintorius is a pretty fun red/white graveyard recursion card with some spirit tribal elements thrown in. His only issue is, well, he was printed in the same set as Hoffrey Ghostforge, who plays in a similar, although not identical design space, but is just generally much more powerful for the same mana cost. These 2 cards are super strong when they're on the battlefield together, as they reanimate any of your non-token creatures that die, and give you a 5/3 hasty trampling spirit token as well, but personally, I'd rather have Hoffrey as the head of the deck than Quintorius. There's a pretty huge gap separating the bottom 3 students on this list from the top 2. Killian Ink Duelist is currently registered as the commander of more than twice as many decks as Quintorius, at 2,083. For a white and a black, Killian is a 2/3 with lifelink and menace, who makes spells you cast that target a creature 2 cheaper. Killian is a neat commander because his effect is very versatile. The natural choice when you see Killian is to build a Voltron deck. He's got 2 strong keyword abilities, and I'll make any auras you pile on top of him cheaper. So go nuts building a super Voltron Killian and smashing your opponents in the face with him. But what makes him really shine is that his effect also helps you out in other ways. Your removal spells will also be 2 mana cheaper. Similarly, once you've built up your Mega Voltron Killian, any cards you cast to protect him from your opponent's removal will also be discounted by 2 mana. Honestly, Killian is probably actually my personal favourite card from this cycle, but for whatever reason, I've decided to let the EDH Rec rankings determine my card of choice for this set, and that card is Dina Soul Steeper, who currently leads 4,051 decks, making her the 66th most popular commander of all time, at time of recording. For a green and a black, Dina is a 1/3 who causes your opponents to lose life whenever you gain life, and allows you to sacrifice another creature to give her +X/+O, where X is that creature's power. Witherbloom's merging of life gain and sacrifice strategies is encapsulated in Dina, who supports both of these. She also appeared on an episode of Game Nights, and that's pretty good for a commander's popularity usually. You can also win games absurdly easily with her at the head of your deck by combining her with Exquisite Blood. When Exquisite Blood is in play, any life gain effect will cause these cards to bleed your opponents out in little tiny 1 damage increments. It's pretty brutal, and Exquisite Blood is kind of a problematic card. So that was a new format for determining my card of the set. I'm probably not going to do that again. I mean, there's only 1 video left in this series before we reach the present, but there you have it. By the metric of EDH Rec popularity, Dina has been deemed my card of choice for Strixhaven. In July of 2021, Magic's first standard legal crossover set came along. Adventures in the Forgotten Realms crossed Magic over with Dungeons & Dragons, the world's most popular role-playing game, which is also owned by Wizards of the Coast. Adventures in the Forgotten Realms is Magic the Gathering's best-selling summer release of all time, and it was fine. The set is essentially a core set with a D&D coat of paint over the top, so, like most core sets, it's functional without being hugely exciting or complex. Its limited environment was also, sadly, not terribly well balanced, with black-red treasures being by far the most powerful archetype. The podcast Lords of Limited probably hit the nail on the head best when they said,
you got to start us off here with point number 1. This is so good.
Number 1, credit to Twitch chat. I can't take credit for this. AFR stands for Always Force Rakdos.
I really can't think of a better, more succinct way to sum up the format than that sentence.
It's so true. This format for me, when I look back at formats, War of the Spark, I think Planeswalkers and, the games, how that played out, always having to be on board. There's things that you associate with formats, or Eldraine, mana bases. Adventures in Forgotten Realms for me is not going to be, the dungeons, or it's not going to be dice rolling. It's going to be color imbalance. That's going to be the thing that sticks with me.
There was one pretty big innovation with this set though, the venture mechanic. Several cards in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms have venture, meaning that when they're played, you either venture into the dungeon or advance to the next room. What does this mean? Well, there are 3 little token dungeons which AFR introduced to the game. The Lost Mines of Phandelver, the Tomb of Annihilation, and the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Whenever you venture, you move through to the next room listed in these dungeons and you get a little reward. Or, in most of the rooms of the Tomb of Annihilation, a little punishment contained within. Venture is by far the most exciting thing about Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. It's a really novel new mechanic. Although it's exciting though, Venture is a bit underpowered. You're not going to want to put a 4/3 for 4 into your deck, whether it's letting you scry or create a treasure token. I completely get why Adventure was tuned down a bit. This is some really new design space, and it's better to be cautious when playing around with completely new mechanics like this. If the folks at Wizards have pushed the effect on these dungeons too much, and that ended up breaking the game, that would have been pretty dreadful. Many Venture cards have ended up getting buffed in Alchemy. Probably the clearest example of this is Dungeon Descent, which has had the cost to activate its ability reduced by 3, and it no longer needs to enter play tapped. We also got a buffed up version of the Venture mechanic, along with a new dungeon with the Initiative, and Venture into the Undercity mechanics, which were introduced in Commander Legends The Battle for Baldur's Gate. Although I feel that Venture into the Undercity and regular Venture interact slightly awkwardly. Regardless, Venture was probably the most exciting thing about Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, even if ultimately it isn't a hugely powerful mechanic. Anyway, discussing all about dungeon delving's been a bit of a side quest. Let's get back to the matter at hand and choose a card to represent the set. I'm going to go with Deadly Dispute. Deadly Dispute is a 2-mana spell, which requires you to sacrifice an artifact or creature in order to draw 2 cards and create a treasure token. Sacrifice effects have been a part of the game for a long time, and Deadly Dispute shows just how far we've come since the days of Altar's Reap, being more flexible in what it lets you sacrifice and granting you a greater reward. I've chosen Deadly Dispute partly because it serves as a key part of the Rakdos treasure deck in AFR's limited environment, and partly because of its impact in Standard and Pauper. Deadly Dispute is an all-star in Pauper affinity decks. It can be used to sacrifice your Ica Wellsprings, drawing you an extra card, and leaving you net neutral in terms of the number of artifacts you have in play. The fact that it generates a new artifact token is what makes Deadly Dispute such a great sacrifice spell. You can even cast a second Deadly Dispute to sacrifice the treasure token you generate using your first dispute, leaving you with 4 cards and a treasure token for 4 mana. The card currently commands a price tag of over $1, which, whilst obviously not that much, is pretty neat when you consider it's a common rarity card which has been reprinted twice over the past 2 years. Innistrad Midnight Hunt burst free from its restraints in September of 2021. I could represent it with the Meat Hook Massacre, one of the most powerful blackboard wipes ever printed, which was included in the set. But I won't. I could represent it with Adeline Resplendent Kafar, a very powerful mono-white go-wide card, but I won't. I could go with Unnatural Growth, an iconic power and toughness doubling card with 4 green mana pips in its cost, but nah, I'm not going to do that either. I think the best card to represent Midnight Hunt is the Humble Organ Hoarder. A common 3/2 zombie for 3 and a blue. When Organ Hoarder enters play, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the others into your graveyard. So why Organ Hoarder? Well, I feel it's a card which is illustrative of the small tragedy of Midnight Hunt's limited format. Now I say its limited format was a small tragedy, by that I don't mean it was bad. It was pretty good. Not great or anything, but it was nice. Instead, I mean that Innistrad Midnight Hunt's limited environment didn't really match the way the set was being marketed. Midnight Hunt was supposed to be the werewolf set. It featured a whole bunch of werewolves, both in red and green, the colour pairs themed around the tribe, and beyond. We also got Tovalar, Dire Overlord, head and shoulders the best werewolf commander of all time. I'm sorry, Ulrich. And currently the most popular Gruul commander of all time, according to EDH rep data. The set was even provisionally known as Innistrad Werewolves prior to release. So sitting at the pre-release or at a Midnight Hunt drafts, you'll be forgiven for thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to build a sweet werewolf deck and kick some tail. But unfortunately, that often won't work out for you, and red-green werewolves are broadly considered to be the absolute weakest colour pair in the format. So why is that? Well, if there's one thing werewolves hate, it's Avacyn's collar, the symbol of her church. But other than that, they also aren't hugely fond of removal spells, and Midnight Hunt was packed full of them. At common alone, Black had Defenestrate, Eaten Alive, and Olivia's Midnight Ambush. And not to mention at uncommon, there was Infernal Grasp, arguably the best Doomblade variant ever printed as it can target unconditionally. And this is all just in black. The format was packed to the gills with quality werewolf destroying removal. Defenestrate was particularly problematic as the set didn't feature any winged werewolves, meaning they could all be targeted and murdered for only 3 mana by a common spell. Midnight Hunt was a graveyard themed set, though, so many of the set's best archetypes were capable of coping with a little bit of removal. Blue/white spirits could fly, avoiding Defenestrate, and were able to return from a graveyard using the Disturb mechanic. Blue-black zombies had lots of graveyard recursion, and would often go so wide that killing individual zombies simply couldn't get the job done. Werewolves, meanwhile, were often reasonably costly to cast, unlike humans and vampires, the final 2 tribes of the set, which were aggro-focused, and thus much more cheaply costed, and werewolves had no way of returning from a graveyard. So if you didn't want to be in green/red, where did you want to be? Well, like I mentioned above, black/blue zombies and blue/white spirits were both a good place to be, and Organ Hoarder slotted in beautifully with either of those 2 decks. In fact, basically any deck running blue wanted an Organ Hoarder. Red/blue Spellslinger could use a Hoarder to slide flashback spells into their graveyard, blue/green had a self-mill theme which Organ Hoarder supported beautifully, and all of this while providing card draw and a relevant 3/2 body. Organ Hoarder is an incredibly iconic common card for limited. In fact, Luis Scott Vargas said,
Organ Hoarder, head and shoulders and every other body part it's got lying around above everything else. I mean, and blue has a deep roster too. There's a lot of good commons. Baithook Angler, Revenge of the Drowned, Startle, Flip the Switch, all fantastic cards. But yeah, it's definitely Organ Hoarder, just the mythic common of the set, which is not even a category we have.
Right.
Because most sets don't have one. In fact, this isn't kind of the first time I even heard us using this verbiage because it was that much better than every other common. It's just
I wonder if we should make this a category, the Organ Hoarder award for mythic common. I just don't know if we'll see one like this. We'll have to feel it out.
I know that Organ Hoarder looks positively cute compared to some of the busted cards we were talking about last time, like Oko and Uro, but I think I want to show that Magic is more than just its most powerful cards, and even seemingly forgettable cards like this goofy, jar-loving zombie can shine in the right context. Players were invited to RSVP to Olivia Voldaren's extravagant vampire wedding with the set Innistrad Crimson Vow, which released in November of 2021. Whilst Midnight Hunt was, at least intended, to focus on werewolves, Crimson Vow was intended to be the big vampire set. Red/black vampires were focused around making use of the set's new marquee mechanic, blood tokens. Blood tokens are artifacts which can be sacrificed to allow you to discard a card and then draw a new one. Some people like to conceptualize this by imagining that when you have a blood token in play, every card in your deck has cycling. Crimson Vow's vampires both generated blood tokens and made use of them in interesting ways. For example, Blood Bat Summoner turns them into 2/2 flying bats, and Blood Hypnotist stops one of your opponents from blocking when you sacrifice some blood. In Crimson Vow, vampires also showed up a little bit in white, and then there's Runo off in Dimir hanging out with his Eldritch Sea Monster pals. The other notable thing about Crimson Vow is that its limited environment was very focused on powerful rares, in contrast with Midnight Hunt, which was more common oriented. Unlike Midnight Hunt, where removal was plentiful and powerful, in Crimson Vow removal is kind of bad. Due to the set's weak removal, if you could get a powerful rare into play like Hullbreaker Horror, Ava Brooke Caretaker, or Olivia herself, you would often end up carrying the game, unless your opponent could answer it with a powerful rare of their own. The most powerful and board-warping rare in the set is a Slug Horror, specifically Toxrill the Corrosive, which will be our card to represent the set. Most limited formats are focused on amassing a huge board of creatures, whilst your opponent does the same. You then need to hope that your board is either more powerful or more evasive, so you can break through your opponent's guard and win the game. Crimson Vow's limited format is no exception, and Toxrill takes advantage of Limited's inherently attritional and creature-focused nature to win games. Every turn, Toxrill saps away the strength of your opponent's board, putting -1/-1 slime counters on each of their creatures. Once those creatures die, whether through Toxrill's effect or any other means, you get a 1/1 slug token. In this way, Toxrill both tears down your opponent's board whilst helping you amass your own. Toxrill also isn't the only creature from our third trip to Innistrad that cares about slime counters either. Sludge Monster from Midnight Hunt gives an opponent's creature a slime counter when it enters play and whenever it attacks, and also turns any creature with a slime counter on it into a 2/2. Combining these cards is pretty fun, as they can be used to kill anything in a turn. Sludge Monster turns its target into a 2/2 with a slime counter, then during the end step, Toxrill gives it another slime counter, meaning it now has -2/-2, and you now have an extra slug buddy in play. Of course, this combo is probably too expensive to see play outside of Commander or an Innistrad double feature draft, if you're lucky enough to pull both of these pretty rare cards, but unlucky enough to be playing an Innistrad double feature draft. So, here we are at the end of part 17. We've discussed significantly fewer banned cards in this episode than the previous one, and that's always a plus. This wraps up the history of 2021 in Magic, so in our next episode we'll be heading into 2022. Wow. Since I discovered a few videos ago that I quite like conducting polls, let's have a look at the results from our previous two. 193 of you responded to my poll on the power level of the game. It's a pretty even split between people who feel the power level is currently too high, 46%, and people who think the power level of the game is just right, 48%. A wonderfully spiky 6% of you also said you think the game's power level is too low. My poll about treasure tokens had a more decisive result, with 70% of the 94 respondents saying they'd like to see fewer treasure tokens being printed, 26% saying they're happy with the rate at which they're currently being printed, and 4% saying they'd like more treasure to be printed. For this video, I'm going to ask you guys how you feel about Crimson Vow and Midnight Hunt compared to previous Innistrad sets. With Guilds of Ravnica in late 2018, we've started returning to Plains for the third time. I'm curious to know how you guys feel Innistrad 3 compares to the two preceding Innistrad blocks. I'll save my personal opinion for once they announce the results of the poll after the next video. In our next episode, we'll be discussing Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, Streets of New Capenna, and Dominaria United, which, at the time of recording, hasn't actually come out yet. If the episode gets really delayed, we may also end up talking about Brothers' War, but hopefully that won't be the case. Hopefully as well, I haven't caused any time paradoxes by discussing the future of Magic in a series about its history, and I'll see you all next time.